A millionaire helped a child selling candy on the street. When he goes to the hospital to visit the kid's mother, she opens her eyes wide and exclaims, "The sun hung high over Houston's bustling downtown, beating down on the pavement with an unrelenting intensity that made the air shimmer like rippling glass." Michael stood on the corner of Main and McKinney, clutching a small tattered basket filled with neatly wrapped candy. His sneakers, frayed at the edges and visibly worn, barely shielded his feet from the heat rising from the concrete. Sweat trickled down his temples, but his gaze remained steady, scanning the passing crowd with a quiet determination far beyond his 6 years. "Candy, ma'am?" he asked, stepping toward a sharply dressed woman in heels that clicked against the sidewalk. She barely glanced at him, pulling her purse closer, as if his small figure posed a threat. Her perfume lingered in the air, mingling briefly with the dusty smell of the city. Michael let her go without another word, his tiny shoulders straightening as he turned back to the throng of people brushing past him. Around him, Houston moved with its usual rhythm, businessmen checking their watches, tourists pointing at skyscrapers, and street vendors shouting over the cacophony of car horns and distant construction. Nobody paused for the boy with the basket. Nobody noticed the hunger in his wide brown eyes, or the way his fingers gripped the basket handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Please, sir, just $1, Michael said to an older man in a suit, holding up a wrapped peppermint. The man waved him off without breaking stride, his cell phone pressed to his ear. Michael watched him disappear into the crowd, his outstretched hand slowly falling back to his side. The basket felt heavier than ever. He adjusted it with a sigh and sat down on the edge of the curb, careful to keep his legs tucked under him so he wouldn't trip anyone. The streets of Houston had little patience for hesitation, especially from someone like him. A child, too small to be selling, too young to be burdened with this kind of responsibility. In a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Carolyn lay on a lumpy mattress pushed against the wall. The room was dim, lit only by the slivers of sunlight seeping through the frayed curtains. A persistent cough racked her body, leaving her breathless and trembling. She pressed a hand against her chest, willing the pain to subside. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and stale air, its silence broken only by the creak of a ceiling fan that rotated lazily overhead. Carolyn turned her head toward the door, her thoughts fixating on Michael. She had begged him not to go out today, but he had insisted, his small face set in a look of determination she couldn't argue against. He had kissed her forehead before leaving, whispering, "I'll be back soon, Mama. Rest, okay?" Carolyn's chest tightened, not from illness this time, but from a deep, gnawing guilt. She had promised Michael a childhood of laughter and love, but all she had given him was a life of sacrifice and struggle. Her vision blurred as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. "Stay strong for him," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Back on Main Street, Michael stood once more, his resolve hardening with every rejection. He watched as a woman handed a beggar $1, her face lit with sympathy. Yet when Michael approached her, offering a piece of chocolate in exchange for the same, she shook her head and hurried away. He didn't understand why people would give to one and not the other. Weren't they both just trying to survive? The hours dragged on, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Michael's stomach growled, but he ignored it. The candy wasn't for him. Every dollar he earned was meant for his mother's medicine, a lifeline they couldn't afford to lose. He clung to that thought like a shield, deflecting the cold glances and muttered dismissals thrown his way. As the shadows grew longer, Michael spotted a small cluster of children his age, their faces clean and carefree as they laughed and played with a frisbee in the nearby park. For a moment, his steps faltered, the basket in his hand suddenly feeling like a barrier separating him from their world. He swallowed hard, forcing his gaze back to the sidewalk in front of him. There was no time for games. His mother needed him. When Michael finally returned home, the sky was streaked with hues of orange and pink. He opened the door quietly, stepping inside to find Carolyn still lying on the mattress. Her face lit up weakly when she saw him, her hand reaching out as if the sight of him alone gave her strength. "Did you sell much today, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael set the basket down and kneeled beside her, pulling a few crumpled bills and coins from his pocket. "Enough to get some medicine tomorrow," he said, forcing a smile. He didn't tell her about the blister forming on his heel or the hours he had spent without a single sale. It didn't matter. He had made it through another day, and for now, that was enough. Carolyn stroked his cheek with a trembling hand, her eyes glistening with pride and sadness. "You're so strong, Michael," she murmured. "Stronger than I'll ever be." Suddenly, Carolyn's breathing became light. She gently let go of her hands that were on Michael. Her vision darkened. "Mom?" he called out, his voice uncertain. Carolyn didn't answer. Panic surged through Michael as he dropped his candy box, and the screams became louder. "Mom! Wake up! Please!" His small hands shook her shoulders gently, but her head lolled to one side. The boy's chest tightened, and tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away. There was no time to cry. He grabbed the empty water bottle and ran out the door, his feet pounding against the pavement as he shouted for help. The hospital was cold and smelled of antiseptic, a harsh contrast to the humid streets Michael had left behind. He clutched Carolyn's hand as a nurse helped him guide her to a wheelchair. Her face was pale, her breaths shallow and uneven. Michael's heart raced as he watched her slump forward, her head lolling weakly. "She needs a doctor," Michael said, his small voice trembling as they reached the reception desk. The nurse gave them a cursory glance before pointing toward a clipboard. "Fill this out and wait," she said flatly. Michael's fingers fumbled with the pen, the form's tiny print overwhelming him. A doctor eventually appeared, but his expression shifted the moment he saw Carolyn's worn clothes and Michael's candy-stained shirt. The man's tone was brisk, clinical. "She'll need tests. Blood work, x-rays, maybe more. You'll have to pay up front for those," the doctor said, handing Michael a piece of paper with the cost scribbled across it. Michael stared at the numbers. He didn't know exactly how much it was, but he knew it was more money than he'd ever seen. "Please, sir, can you help her now?" "I'll pay. Just later," he pleaded. The doctor sighed. "I'm sorry. Hospital policy." Tears welled in Michael's eyes as Carolyn's shallow breathing filled the silence. He wiped his face and stood straighter. "I'll get the money," he said, his voice firm. Turning back toward the door, he gripped his candy box tighter, the weight of his mother's life on his small shoulders. The streetlights flickered to life as the day's heat gave way to a muggy Houston evening. The city roared on, unrelenting, a symphony of car horns, muffled conversations, and the rhythmic hum of air conditioners. Michael's small figure moved through the haze, weaving between groups of passers-by, the candy box bouncing lightly against his chest. His steps were uneven now, fatigue softening the determined edge of his voice. "Candy, just $1, he called, his voice hoarse and cracking. But there was a thread of steel in it, unyielding, almost defiant. Across the street, Jonathan Lockwood stepped out of a gleaming glass building, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk. He tugged at his tie, loosening it as he breathed in the thick, warm air. His meeting had ended an hour ago, but the weight of the day clung to him like a stubborn shadow. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was Brittany, again. He ignored the call, slipping the phone back into his jacket. The thought of another dinner, filled with her carefully curated charm and shallow laughter, made his chest tighten. They had started seeing each other again a few months ago, but the spark was gone, smothered under layers of time and doubt. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that her affection was more for his bank account than for him. As he crossed the street, his eyes landed on Michael. The boy stood near the corner, his small frame dwarfed by the rush of people moving around him. Something about the way Michael held himself, unyielding yet fragile, caught Jonathan's attention. He slowed his pace, watching as Michael approached a man in a suit, holding out a candy bar. "Sir, please, it's just $1, Michael said, his voice strained but unwavering. The man didn't stop. He brushed past Michael as though he didn't exist. The boy's words drowned in the swell of the city's noise. Michael hesitated for a moment, his shoulders drooping slightly, before he straightened and moved to the next group. Jonathan found himself rooted in place, his curiosity piqued. He had seen street kids before, Houston wasn't short on them. But there was something about this one. It wasn't just the persistence. It was the desperation behind it, the rawness that came through in his voice. Without fully understanding why, Jonathan stepped closer. "Hey, kid," he called. Michael turned, his eyes wary but hopeful. "You want some candy?" he asked quickly, holding up a slightly crumpled chocolate bar. "Just $1." Jonathan studied him for a moment. The boy's face was streaked with grime, his eyes too old for someone so young. His clothes hung loose on his small frame, and his shoes, Jonathan couldn't stop noticing those shoes, were so worn they barely clung together. "What are you doing out here this late?" Jonathan asked. Michael shifted on his feet. "Selling candy?" "For what?" Michael hesitated, clutching the box tighter. "For my mum. She's sick," he said, his voice quieter now, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. Jonathan felt a strange tug in his chest, an echo of something he couldn't quite name. He glanced at his watch, then back at Michael. "Where's your mum?" "At home," Michael said quickly. Then, after a pause, "Well, not really. She's at the hospital now." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What's wrong with her?" The boy's shoulders Brittany in a small shrug, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with fear, the kind that came from understanding too much too soon. "She's just sick." Jonathan hesitated. The rational part of him whispered to keep walking. This wasn't his problem, and the city was full of stories like this one. But another part, quieter but insistent, told him to stay. He didn't know why, but he wanted to know more. "All right," Jonathan said, pulling out his wallet. "I'll buy the candy, all of it." Michael's face lit up, his hands fumbling as he shoved candy bars into Jonathan's hands. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Jonathan handed him the bills, then paused. "Take me to the hospital." Michael froze. "What?" "Your mom," Jonathan said, his voice softer now. "Take me to her." Michael's eyes darted around, searching for some kind of trap, but Jonathan's face was calm, his tone steady. After a long moment, Michael nodded. "Okay." As they walked, Jonathan found his mind wandering. He glanced down at the boy beside him, his tiny feet moving quickly to keep up. There was a quiet resilience in Michael, a strength that reminded Jonathan of himself at a younger age, a version he had buried under years of boardrooms and stock reports. The hospital loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights stark against the encroaching darkness. Jonathan's chest tightened as they approached the entrance. He didn't know what he was walking into, but a strange feeling settled over him, one he hadn't felt in years. The hospital doors hissed open, releasing a gust of sterile, chilled air that prickled Michael's sweat-dampened skin. He tightened his grip on the candy box strapped to his neck, glancing nervously at Jonathan, who strode in beside him. Jonathan scanned the room, taking in the rows of rigid plastic chairs occupied by worn faces, the quiet murmur of a television in the corner, and the distant beeping of medical monitors. The faint smell of disinfectant mingled with the stale odor of unwashed clothes from some of the waiting patients. It was a far cry from the private clinics he was accustomed to. Michael's small voice broke the silence. "She's over there." Jonathan followed his gaze to a corner where Carolyn lay in a worn hospital bed, her face pale against the thin, grey pillow. Her frail hands gripped the sides of the blanket as if bracing herself against some unseen force. Her chest, Brittany, and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Jonathan frowned, a quiet unease settling in his stomach. Carolyn stirred as Michael approached, her eyes fluttering open. The moment her gaze landed on Jonathan, her entire body stiffened. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Fear flashed across her face, quickly replaced by disbelief. Jonathan caught the change, his brows furrowing. "Do I know you?" he asked hesitantly, his voice low but clear. Carolyn's fingers gripped the edge of the blanket tighter, her knuckles whitening. The memories surged back with startling clarity. The hotel room, the soft glow of city lights filtering through the curtains, and the man who had stumbled into her life, only to disappear the next morning. She hadn't expected to see him again, least of all here. Carolyn began, her voice hoarse and unsteady, but Michael interrupted, his tone cheerful and oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. "Mom, this is Mr. Jonathan. He bought all my candy and came to help you." Michael's words tumbled out, his pride evident. He turned to Jonathan, his wide eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Really?" Jonathan managed a small smile, but his attention remained on Carolyn. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face, though he couldn't quite place it. "You look familiar," he said slowly, the words more to himself than to her. Carolyn averted her gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't decide if she felt relief or dread. "It's nothing," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be mistaken." Michael, oblivious to the undercurrents of the exchange, plopped himself onto the chair beside her bed. "Mum, he's really nice. He said he'd help us." His small hand reached out to touch hers, his smile bright and reassuring. Jonathan's gaze softened as he watched the boy. He pulled a chair closer and sat down, leaning forward slightly. "What happened to her?" he asked Michael quietly, his voice edged with genuine concern. "She's just sick," Michael said simply, his youthful naivety masking the weight of the situation. "But the doctor said we need a lot of money to help her." Jonathan's jaw tightened at the boy's words. His eyes flicked to Carolyn, noting the hollowed contours of her cheeks and the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. He had seen desperation before, but something about this moment, the boy's unwavering optimism, despite the odds, the mother's fragile strength, gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Carolyn finally looked at him again, her expression guarded but tinged with something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or resignation. "Thank you for helping, Michael," she said quietly, her words measured and careful. Jonathan nodded, his thoughts clouded with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. "It's the least I could do," he replied, his voice steady. The conversation lulled, and the room seemed to hum with the quiet rhythm of the hospital, a distant monitor beeping, a nurse's hurried steps, the occasional murmur of voices. Jonathan glanced at Michael, who had fallen silent, his small hand still resting on Carolyn's. "I'll make sure she gets what she needs," Jonathan said finally, his tone firmer now, as if solidifying a decision he hadn't realized he was making. Carolyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her emotions a tangle of gratitude and uncertainty. She didn't know if she could trust this man, didn't know if she should. But as her eyes lingered on Michael, who sat with a quiet determination so much like her own, she realized she didn't have the luxury of choice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't enough, but it was all she could manage. Jonathan stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "I'll talk to the doctors," he said, glancing back at Michael. "Stay with your mom." As he walked toward the nurse's station, Carolyn watched him go, her mind racing. The weight of the past pressed heavily on her chest, mingling with the uncertainty of what the future might hold. Michael shifted in his seat, leaning closer to her. "It's going to be okay, Mom," he said softly. His voice, tiny, yet so full of hope, was the only thing keeping her grounded in that moment. Carolyn reached out weakly to touch his cheek, her hand trembling. "I hope so, sweetheart," she murmured. "I really hope so." The hospital room faded into the recesses of Carolyn's mind as memories surged forward, unbidden but relentless. She closed her eyes, the quiet hum of the monitors blending into the whispers of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. A younger, more hopeful version of herself. It was 6 years ago, on a rainy Houston evening, when she first met Jonathan. She had been working the night shift at the downtown hotel, her feet aching after hours on her feet. The lobby had been quiet except for the occasional click of heels on the marble floor or the rustle of newspapers from guests lounging in leather chairs. Then he appeared, stumbling through the revolving doors, his suit slightly rumpled and his tie loosened as though it had been strangling him all day. Carolyn remembered the way he looked, tired, vulnerable, yet carrying an air of dignity that even his disheveled state couldn't diminish. He had mumbled something about a room, his words slurring slightly, and she had guided him gently to the reception desk. There was an ache in his eyes, one that mirrored her own, though she had no idea then what had driven him to drown himself in alcohol. "Rough night?" she had asked softly, more out of politeness than curiosity. He had glanced at her, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "You could say that," he had replied, his voice tinged with a weariness that struck her deeply. The rest of the night was a blur of quiet exchanges, shared glances, and a connection that neither of them could explain. She had brought him water and aspirin and made sure he got to his room safely. What followed was an impulsive, fleeting moment of intimacy. Two strangers seeking solace in the chaos of their own lives. By morning, he was gone, leaving nothing but the faint scent of his cologne and a hollow ache in her chest. Months later, Carolyn discovered she was pregnant. The news had shaken her, but not as much as the realization that she had no way of contacting Jonathan. She didn't even know his last name. All she had were hazy memories of his face and the brief warmth of his presence. Her life quickly became a series of sacrifices. She left the hotel job. The late hours and physical demands were too taxing for her growing body. Instead, she found work at a small diner, juggling long shifts and swollen feet as she prepared for the arrival of her child. Michael was born on a cold January morning, his first cries piercing through her exhaustion like a beacon of hope. From the moment she held him, she knew she would do anything to protect him. The years that followed were hard, a relentless grind of work and worry. Carolyn took on every odd job she could find, cleaning houses, delivering newspapers, even mending clothes for neighbors. The pay was meager, but it was enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Michael grew up knowing the taste of sacrifice, though she did her best to shield him from the worst of it. But her body bore the toll. The constant exhaustion, the skipped meals to ensure Michael had enough, the nights spent sewing by dim light, they all added up. Her health began to fail, subtle at first, a persistent cough, a weakness in her limbs. She ignored the signs, brushing off Michael's concerns with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Now, lying in the hospital bed, Carolyn's chest tightened. Not from illness, but from the sight of Jonathan standing there. She couldn't reconcile the man in the polished suit, speaking with authority to the nurses, with the broken stranger she had met all those years ago. He didn't remember her, that much was clear, and maybe it was better that way. Her thoughts swirled with doubts. Should she tell him the truth? What if he rejected Michael and refused to believe her? The idea of watching her son's hopeful smile fade was more than she could bear. But then, what if she didn't tell him? What if she left Michael without a father, without the support he desperately needed now that her own strength was failing? She glanced at Michael, his small hand still resting on hers, his face peaceful in the faint glow of the overhead light. He was so much like Jonathan. His stubbornness, his determination, even the way his brows furrowed when he was deep in thought. The resemblance was undeniable. Carolyn swallowed hard, her gaze shifting to the door where Jonathan had disappeared moments ago. She didn't trust him. How could she? But she didn't luxuriate in trust or pride anymore. Her son's future was at stake, and for that, she would take the risk. Closing her eyes, she exhaled shakily. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she knew what she had to do. For Michael, she would find the courage to face the past, no matter what it brought. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet as Jonathan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes traced the cracks in the tile floor. But his thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling back to places he had long buried, to memories he had chosen to forget. Brittany's name echoed in his mind, accompanied by the sting of old wounds. She had left him at the worst possible time, walking out the door with no warning, no explanation. His company had been teetering on the edge of ruin then, every investment a gamble, every decision a precarious balancing act. He'd barely been able to keep it afloat, pouring himself into late nights and sleepless weekends, trying to salvage what was left of the empire he had worked so hard to build. And yet, she had left. He could still see her that day, perfectly composed, her voice as calm and deliberate as her carefully rehearsed goodbye. "This isn't working anymore, Jonathan," she had said, her eyes cool and distant. He had begged her to stay and had promised her that things would get better. But Brittany wasn't the type to stick around when the foundation began to crack. She had left Houston shortly after, disappearing into a life he could only imagine. The pain of her departure had been unbearable at the time, though now it felt more like a dull ache, a scar that had faded but never truly healed. That night, 6 years ago, he had sought solace in the anonymity of the city. A bar, too many drinks, and then a hotel lobby. The memory stirred uneasily in his mind, fragmented but insistent. A soft voice had greeted him, polite but laced with concern. A woman. What was her name? He struggled to remember, the details slipping through his fingers like sand. Her face was blurry in his mind, but the kindness in her tone lingered. She had helped him to his room, given him water, and stayed longer than she needed to. His brows furrowed as the pieces began to shift and align, though imperfectly. Had there been more? He felt the whisper of another memory, fleeting and shadowed. A faint scent of lavender, the rustle of sheets, the hollow quiet of a room that wasn't his. Jonathan shook his head, his frustration mounting. He had buried that night, convinced it had meant nothing, a moment of weakness in a time of chaos. But now, standing here in this hospital, that buried memory clawed its way back to the surface, refusing to be ignored. His gaze shifted toward the room where Carolyn lay. Her face was gaunt, her body frail, but there had been something in her eyes when she looked at him, something raw and unguarded, like recognition mixed with apprehension. It unsettled him. And then there was Michael, a boy who looked so much like himself as a child that it made his chest tighten. The resemblance couldn't be a coincidence. Jonathan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. His life, carefully constructed over years of calculated decisions, suddenly felt precarious, like a house of cards swaying in the breeze. He had built walls around himself, walls of success, money, and power. But standing here, those walls felt flimsy, transparent. His relationship with Brittany, rekindled months ago, seemed almost absurd now. He had convinced himself it was what he wanted, that their history was enough to justify their future. But each dinner, each conversation, had left him emptier than the last. Her laugh, once infectious, now felt hollow. Her words, once charming, now felt rehearsed. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how little they truly understood each other. Michael's innocent face flashed in his mind, followed by Carolyn's trembling voice as she thanked him. He didn't know why he had agreed to help, or why he had stayed instead of walking away. But the boy's determination and Carolyn's quiet strength stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility, connection, humanity. As Jonathan reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Inside the room, Carolyn stirred as Jonathan stepped back in. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of tension and recognition. She broke the gaze quickly, looking away as if the effort of holding his stare was too much. Jonathan cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. "The doctors will check on you soon," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. He glanced at Michael, who was still sitting by her side, his small hand resting protectively on hers. Carolyn's lips pressed into a thin line and she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, though her tone was guarded, almost cautious. Jonathan sat in the chair beside Michael, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to ask Carolyn if they had met before, and wanted to know why she looked at him with such a strange mix of fear and familiarity. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he looked at Michael. "How long have you been selling candy?" he asked. Michael perked up at the question, his youthful energy breaking through the somber atmosphere. "A few weeks," he said proudly. "Mom needed medicine, so I thought I could help." Jonathan nodded slowly, his chest tightening. He had once prided himself on his ability to read people, to see their motivations and ambitions. But this boy was different. His selflessness, his quiet strength. It was disarming. Jonathan looked at Carolyn again. She was watching Michael, her expression softening in a way that made him feel like an intruder. The realization hit him like a slow tide creeping in. This woman and her son, they weren't just strangers in need of help. They were forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long buried, his failures, his regrets, and the hollow space where something meaningful should have been. Dear friends who are listening to this story, do you have a small family of your own? If you do, please leave a comment. Family. If not, please write love. We will continue to listen. The air in the hospital room hung heavy, filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the faint murmur of voices from the corridor outside. Carolyn lay back against the thin pillow, her frail form almost blending into the bed's stark white sheets. Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket, her gaze shifting uneasily between Michael and Jonathan. She couldn't keep the truth bottled up any longer. It had gnawed at her from the moment she saw him walk through that door. But the words wouldn't come easily. They caught in her throat, burdened by fear and doubt. "Michael," she began softly, her voice strained. "Sweetheart, could you step out for a moment? I need to speak with Mr. Jonathan." Michael tilted his head, confused, but he nodded obediently. "Okay, Mum." He hopped off the chair, his small frame dwarfed by the heavy hospital door as he pushed it open and slipped into the hallway. Jonathan's gaze followed Michael until the door clicked shut. Then he turned to Carolyn, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. Carolyn exhaled shakily, her hands clutching the blanket as though it were the only thing anchoring her. I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Michael." Jonathan frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What about him?" Her lips trembled, and she closed her eyes, summoning the courage to continue. He's your son." The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Jonathan froze, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. "What?" he said, his tone edged with disbelief. Carolyn opened her eyes, her gaze steady now, despite the vulnerability etched across her face. "That night, 6 years ago, at the hotel, I didn't know how to find you afterward, and when I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. I raised him alone." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his breath escaping in a sharp exhale. His mind raced, the fragments of memory from that night crashing together. The soft voice, the kindness, the warmth of a fleeting connection. It had been her. And Michael. The resemblance he had brushed off earlier now felt glaringly obvious. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "I mean, are you sure he's mine?" Carolyn flinched slightly at the question, but she nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't sure." Jonathan rubbed his temples, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions. Shock, disbelief, guilt, and a strange sense of inevitability. He had spent years avoiding connections, keeping people at arm's length, and now, out of nowhere, he was faced with something he couldn't ignore. He paused, his voice faltering. "I need to confirm this." Carolyn nodded again, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I understand," she said quietly. "A DNA test. Do whatever you need to do." Jonathan stood abruptly, pacing the small room. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, a stark contrast to the stillness that had settled over Carolyn. He felt as though the walls were closing in, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "Why didn't you try to find me?" he asked suddenly, his tone sharper than he intended. Carolyn's eyes flickered with pain. "Do you think I didn't want to?" she replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't know your last name, your address, nothing. You were a stranger to me, and I didn't have the resources to track you down. All I could do was focus on raising Michael, giving him everything I could." Her words cut through him like a blade. He stopped pacing, his gaze dropping to the floor. He couldn't deny the truth in what she said, and yet the guilt simmering beneath the surface refused to relent. "I'll arrange the test," he said finally, his voice quieter now. If Michael is my son, I'll do what I can to help. To be there." Carolyn's eyes softened, though the lines of worry on her face didn't ease. "That's all I ask," she said. The door creaked open, and Michael peeked inside, his curious eyes darting between the two adults. "Can I come back now?" he asked, his tone light and innocent. Jonathan glanced at Carolyn, who nodded faintly. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady again. "Come here." Michael hurried back to her side, climbing onto the chair and taking her hand in his. He smiled up at Jonathan, his expression bright and trusting. "Thanks for helping my mom, Mr. Jonathan." Jonathan forced a small smile, though his thoughts were far from settled. As he looked at Michael, at the boy's wide eyes and determined spirit, something shifted within him. The walls he had built so carefully over the years began to crack, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't try to rebuild them. Instead, he sat down beside Michael, a quiet determination growing in his chest. Whatever the test revealed, he couldn't turn away now. The sterile smell of the hospital seemed sharper as Jonathan sat in the waiting room, staring at the envelope in his hands. The words, DNA test results, printed on the front, felt almost mocking in their simplicity. He had requested the test with calm determination, but now, holding the answer, he hesitated. His fingers brushed the edges of the envelope, but he didn't open it. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Memories of Michael's determined smile and Carolyn's frail voice haunted him, interwoven with the chaos of his thoughts. He wanted to be ready for whatever was inside, but part of him feared what it might change, or confirm. A nurse passed by, her hurried footsteps echoing in the corridor. The distant sound of a baby crying seemed to snap him back into focus. He exhaled deeply, unfolding the envelope with careful hands, as if rushing might alter the truth inside. The results were undeniable. Michael was his son. Jonathan leaned back in the stiff chair, the air rushing from his lungs as though he had been punched. Relief, disbelief, and guilt swirled inside him, each emotion vying for dominance. His thoughts turned to Michael's short life so far, a life Jonathan hadn't been there to support, a life Carolyn had carried alone. He stood abruptly, clutching the papers as he made his way back to Carolyn's room. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum, his pace quickening as his resolve solidified. Carolyn sat up slightly when he entered, her thin frame supported by a stack of pillows. Michael was perched on the chair beside her, his legs swinging idly. He looked up and grinned when Jonathan stepped in. "Hi, Mr. Jonathan," he said brightly. "Did you get the papers?" Jonathan managed a small smile, though his chest felt tight. "Yeah, Michael. I got them." Michael didn't press for details, his attention already shifting back to his mother. His innocence was striking, almost painful, in its contrast to the complicated emotions roiling within the adults. Jonathan watched him for a moment. The boy's joy in such dire circumstances, both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Carolyn cleared her throat softly, drawing Jonathan's attention. Her expression was unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I take it you've seen the results," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Jonathan nodded, stepping closer. He didn't sit. He couldn't. "He's my son," he said simply, the weight of the words settling into the air between them. Carolyn's gaze dropped, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked up again, her eyes meeting his. "I told you because I had no choice," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not strong enough to take care of him the way he deserves anymore. He needs someone who can give him a chance." The vulnerability in her voice cut through Jonathan's defenses. He saw not just a struggling mother, but a woman who had fought tooth and nail for her child, sacrificing everything along the way. And now, in her weakest moment, she was still putting Michael first. Jonathan stepped closer to her bed, his voice softer now. "I should have been there," he said, his words heavy with regret. "For you. For him." Carolyn shook her head. "You didn't know," she said simply. "But you know now." Jonathan knelt slightly, coming to her level. His voice was firm as he spoke. "I won't walk away. I promise you, Carolyn. I'll be there for Michael. For both of you." A tear slipped down Carolyn's cheek, but she didn't brush it away. Instead, she nodded slowly, her body relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael looked between the two of them, a small furrow forming on his brow. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone curious but not concerned. Jonathan crouched beside him, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "Michael," he said, his voice warm, "do you remember when we talked about the test?" Michael nodded. "Yeah. Was it important?" Jonathan smiled faintly, his chest tightening. "Very important," he said. "It means I'm not just here to help your mum. I'm here for you too." Michael blinked, his young mind processing the words slowly. Then his face lit up, his grin wide and unguarded. "So? You're going to stick around?" Jonathan chuckled softly, ruffling Michael's hair. "Yeah, kid. I'm not going anywhere." Michael turned to Carolyn, his excitement bubbling over. "Mum, did you hear that? Mr. Jonathan's staying." Carolyn smiled weakly, her eyes glistening as she reached for Michael's hand. "I heard, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's staying." Jonathan stood, his gaze shifting between Carolyn and Michael. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that much, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a purpose that went beyond boardrooms and bank accounts. As he looked at the small family before him, he made a silent vow to rebuild what had been lost, to protect what had been found, and to be the father Michael deserved. The sleek sound of Jonathan's car pulling into his driveway was always a signal for Brittany. Tonight was no different. She sipped her wine by the living room window, her sharp eyes narrowing as he stepped out, his shoulders heavier than usual. Over the past few weeks, Jonathan had become distant, his once consistent charm replaced with something unspoken and unyielding. Brittany didn't have to wait long to find out why. The envelope labeled DNA test results in his hand had said enough. Jonathan hadn't intended to share the truth with Brittany, but her persistence left him cornered. "It's complicated," he said, his voice tight, hoping to deflect her questions as they sat across from each other in his spacious dining room. Brittany tilted her head, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Complicated," she echoed. "Come on, Jonathan, you can tell me. We're supposed to be rebuilding trust, aren't we?" His jaw tightened. He hated when she turned his words against him. "Fine," he muttered, tossing the DNA test results onto the table between them. "That's my son." For a moment, Brittany's expression froze, her perfectly arched eyebrows rising slightly. Then she laughed, a light, incredulous sound. "Your son? Jonathan, really? Are you sure? This doesn't sound like you." "I'm sure," Jonathan said firmly, the edge in his voice wiping away her feigned amusement. "His name is Michael, and he needs me. His mother, she's not well." Brittany's fingers curled around her wine glass, her knuckles whitening. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice dropping. "You've barely been here, Jonathan. You've been running around playing savior for some woman and her kid, and now I'm just supposed to—" "What? Sit and smile?" "It's not about you, Brittany," Jonathan snapped. "This is my responsibility. My son." Her lips tightened into a thin line, but she forced a smile. "Of course, Jonathan. I understand," she said sweetly, the venom beneath her words barely hidden. "You're doing the noble thing." Jonathan didn't respond. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," he muttered, walking toward the door. Brittany watched him leave, the smile slipping from her face as her grip on the glass tightened. Her mind raced, jealousy and fear twisting into something darker. Jonathan was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't about to let that happen. The next morning, Brittany made a call. Dr. Stephen, a renowned but morally flexible physician, answered on the second ring. "Brittany," he greeted smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need your help," she said, her voice calm and controlled. It's about a patient, a woman named Carolyn. Stephen's interest piqued. Go on. She's under your care at the hospital, Brittany continued. I need you to adjust her treatment. Nothing too drastic, just something that might delay her recovery. There was a brief pause on the other end. Brittany, you know this isn't my first time dealing with unconventional requests, Stephen said. But tampering with someone's care, that's risky. I'll make it worth your while, Brittany said, her tone sharp. And it's not as if we're talking about life-threatening measures, just enough to give me time to ensure certain things fall into place. Stephen sighed, the sound laced with reluctant agreement. Fine, but it won't come cheap. It never does, Brittany replied, her lips curving into a smirk. I'll wire the funds today. Over the next few days, Jonathan began noticing subtle changes in Carolyn's condition. Her energy, which had seemed to improve slightly, began to wane. She grew weaker, her coughing fits more frequent. At first, he chalked it up to the stress of their situation, but as time went on, a nagging suspicion crept into his mind. One evening, he cornered Dr. Stephen after a routine check-in. Why isn't Carolyn improving? He asked, his tone sharp. Her symptoms should be stabilizing by now. Stephen adjusted his glasses, his face betraying nothing. Her condition is complicated, he said smoothly. These things take time. Jonathan frowned. You're sure nothing's been missed? No errors in her treatment? I assure you, Mr. Lockwood, everything is being handled appropriately, Stephen replied, his voice steady. But the brief flicker in his gaze didn't escape Jonathan's notice. As Jonathan walked back to Carolyn's room, unease gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Carolyn deserved better than vague reassurances and complacent care. Michael met him at the door, his small face lighting up as he saw Jonathan. Mom's resting, he said quietly. She was coughing a lot earlier, but she said not to worry. Jonathan forced a smile, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. We'll figure it out, Michael, he said. I promise. But as he looked past the boy to Carolyn's fragile form on the bed, his resolve hardened. Whatever was happening, he would find out. And he wouldn't let anyone jeopardize their chance at a future. Not Brittany. Not Stephen. No one. Carolyn's condition showed no signs of improvement. Her once rare coughing fits became frequent, racking her frail body with exhaustion. Jonathan watched helplessly as Michael's hopeful smile faltered more often, replaced by a worried crease on his young brow. The doctor's reassurances felt hollow to Jonathan. Every update was the same. Her recovery will take time. But time wasn't on their side, and something about the vague explanations gnawed at him. Jonathan decided to trust his instincts. Late one evening, after Michael had fallen asleep beside Carolyn's bed, Jonathan quietly slipped out of the room. He sought out a nurse who had been attentive to Carolyn's care, catching her in the hallway. Can we talk? He asked, his tone low but firm. The nurse hesitated but nodded, leading him to a quiet corner. What's wrong, Mr. Lockwood? I need to know everything about Carolyn's treatment. Every medication, every test result, Jonathan said, his voice steely. And I need honesty. The nurse shifted uneasily. Dr. Stephen oversees her care. You'd have to ask him. I'm asking you, Jonathan interrupted, his gaze unyielding. She hesitated again, then leaned in. Between us, some of her treatments seem unusual. I've worked with Dr. Stephen for years, and this doesn't feel right. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He thanked her quietly and walked away, his mind racing. He knew now that his suspicions weren't unfounded. Carolyn's worsening condition wasn't natural. It was orchestrated, and he was going to uncover who was behind it. One more time, Jonathan had cornered Stepane late in the evening, the hospital quieter than usual, with most of the day's bustle reduced to occasional footsteps echoing down the sterile corridors. Jonathan's persistence had finally worn him down. Under Jonathan's sharp gaze, Stephen hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the corner of a clipboard before speaking. "Fine," Stephen muttered, his voice low and tight. "It was Brittany. She contacted me, insisted on adjustments to Carolyn's treatment." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Adjustments," he repeated, his voice cold. "You mean sabotage?" Stephen sighed, his gaze dropping. "She said it was harmless, just enough to slow things down. She made it clear that she'd handle any fallout." Jonathan's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Fallout? We're talking about someone's life, Stephen. You took an oath to do no harm, or did the price tag make you forget?" The doctor flinched at Jonathan's tone, but didn't respond. Jonathan didn't wait for further justification. He turned on his heel, his mind already racing ahead to his next confrontation. Brittany was waiting in his living room, draped elegantly on the couch as though nothing had changed. Her wine glass rested lightly in her hand, her nails polished to perfection. When Jonathan walked in, his face stormy and his movements deliberate, she arched an eyebrow. "Well, you're home early," she said lightly, taking a sip of her wine. "What's the occasion?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He stood in front of her, his eyes cold, the intensity of his stare cutting through her carefully constructed facade. "What did you do, Brittany?" Brittany tilted her head, feigning confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Carolyn's treatment," he said flatly. "You had Stephen tamper with it." Her lips parted, her breath catching for a split second before she recovered. "Jonathan, Don't lie to me," his voice. Brittany, echoing in the large room. "I know what you did. And for what? To cling to something that was already broken?" Brittany set the glass down, her mask slipping. "Broken? Is that what you think? That I'm the one clinging?" She stood, her voice growing sharper. "You've been running around, playing hero for that woman and her kid, acting like I don't exist." Jonathan's laughter was cold. "That's rich coming from you. You didn't care about me when I needed you most, Brittany, do you remember? My company was on the verge of collapse, and what did you do? You walked away. No explanation, no warning, just gone." Brittany flinched, but didn't back down. "I wasn't going to stand by and watch you destroy yourself," she said defensively. "You were spiraling, Jonathan. I had to think about my future." "Your future," he repeated bitterly. "It was always about you, wasn't it? And now that I've rebuilt everything, you waltz back in like nothing happened, expecting me to fall in line." "I love you," Brittany shot back, though her voice wavered. "No," Jonathan said, his voice cold and final. "You love the idea of me, the money, the status. It was never about who I am, was it? And when I stopped being convenient, you left." Brittany's composure cracked, her face twisting with anger and desperation. "And what about her?" she spat. "You think Carolyn loves you for who you are? She's using you, Jonathan. You're her way out." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Carolyn doesn't have to manipulate people to get what she wants. She's fought for everything, every step of the way. You sabotage lives to keep yourself comfortable." Brittany's shoulders slumped, her confidence draining away under the weight of his words. "Jonathan, Enough." His tone was clipped, final. "We're done, Brittany." "I'm done." Her eyes widened, her lips trembling as she reached for him. "Jonathan, please." He stepped back, his gaze hard. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Pack your things and leave." The silence that followed Brittany's departure was deafening. Jonathan stood by the window, staring out at the night sky, his reflection in the glass a stark reminder of how much his life had changed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from the hospital. "Carolyn's condition is stable. Michael is asking for you." Jonathan exhaled deeply, his chest tightening. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, his thoughts focused on what mattered most now. Carolyn and Michael. The hospital room was quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the steady rhythm of Carolyn's breathing. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft, golden rays across the bed where Carolyn rested. Her cheeks were still pale, but there was a liveliness in her eyes that hadn't been there in weeks. She managed a small smile as Michael climbed onto the chair beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of familiarity. "Mom, you look better," Michael said, his voice full of hope. His innocent optimism brightened the room more than the sunlight ever could. Carolyn squeezed his hand weakly. "I'm trying, sweetheart," she replied, her voice still raspy but stronger than before. Jonathan stood by the window, arms crossed as he watched the exchange. Relief coursed through him. Carolyn's recovery was slow, but it was progress, and for the first time, he felt like they had turned a corner. He turned toward the bed, his gaze softening as he watched Michael lean over to show Carolyn a drawing he had made earlier. "It's us," Michael explained, holding up the colorful piece of paper. "You, me, and Mr. Jonathan." Carolyn's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at Jonathan. He stepped closer, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's good," he said, crouching beside Michael. "You've got my hair just right." Michael grinned. "I worked hard on it." Jonathan ruffled the boy's hair gently. "I can tell." Later that evening, after Michael had fallen asleep in the armchair, Carolyn spoke quietly. "He's happier now," she said, her gaze fixed on her son. "I haven't seen him smile like that in a long time." Jonathan nodded. "He's resilient, just like his mum." Carolyn's eyes flicked to him, searching for sincerity in his words. "Jonathan," she began, her voice hesitant, I need to thank you for everything." "You don't have to," Jonathan interrupted softly. "This is where I'm supposed to be." Carolyn looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I'm still trying to figure out how to trust you. Not for me, but for Michael. He deserves stability, someone who won't leave." Jonathan's chest tightened at her words. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the bed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I didn't know before, Carolyn, but now I do, and I won't let him, or you, down." Carolyn held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I hope you mean that." "I do," Jonathan said, "and I'll prove it." In the days that followed, Jonathan's promise began to manifest in small but meaningful ways. He showed up early to bring Michael breakfast, stayed late to help Carolyn adjust her pillows, and even spent quiet moments playing cards with Michael in the hospital lounge. The bond between father and son grew steadily, their interactions filled with laughter and newfound understanding. For Carolyn, watching them together was bittersweet. She saw in Jonathan a side of him she hadn't expected, the capacity for kindness, patience, and love. It softened the walls she had built, though she wasn't ready to let them down entirely. One afternoon, as Michael sat on the floor drawing yet another picture, Carolyn looked at Jonathan and said, "You've made a difference, you know." Jonathan met her gaze, his expression warm. "So have you," he replied. "You gave him everything when you had nothing. That's not something I take lightly." Carolyn didn't respond immediately, but her lips curved into a faint smile. Hope flickered in her chest, fragile but growing stronger, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that better days were coming. Carolyn's gaze lingered on her son's bright expression, and her chest swelled with hope. For so long, she had carried the weight of their world alone, and now, for the first time, she felt that burden begin to lift. Later, after Michael had been tucked into bed, Jonathan returned to the living room. Carolyn was still on the couch, her hands resting on the edges of the quilt as she gazed out the window. "You're quiet tonight," Jonathan said, taking a seat in the armchair across from her. Carolyn turned to him, her expression contemplative. "I'm just adjusting," she admitted, "to all of this. To you." Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know it's not easy. I've made mistakes, Carolyn. Big ones. But I want to do right by you and Michael." Carolyn studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "You've already done more than I ever expected," she said. "And Michael, he adores you." Jonathan's lips curved into a soft smile. "He's a great kid. Strong, smart. He gets that from you." Carolyn chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "He's got your stubbornness too." They shared a quiet laugh, the tension between them easing. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of possibilities not yet realized, but not entirely out of reach. As the night deepened, Jonathan stood to leave, pausing at the door. "If you need anything at all, just call me. I'll be here." Carolyn nodded, her voice steady. "I know." Jonathan lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. There was no need for words. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Slowly, he stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around him as he made his way to his car. Inside, Carolyn settled back into the couch, her thoughts drifting. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt she wasn't facing it alone. She glanced toward Michael's room, where her son slept peacefully, and smiled. Their family wasn't perfect, and it wasn't whole in the conventional sense, but it was theirs, and it was enough. Together, they were building something new, a foundation of love, trust, and hope. And for Carolyn, Jonathan, and Michael, it was only the beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.